They called him a ghost with a heartbeat. But the day a forgotten man slipped a loaf of bread into his coat, he triggered something no one saw coming, not even the judge who nearly fainted in his chair. What could make an entire courtroom freeze mid-breath over a petty theft? Stay with this, because the answer will punch you right in the soul. Malcolm Reeves, 67, had been part of the neighborhood mosaic in South Brooklyn for over a decade. A man carved out of bone in storms, with a wiry frame and a beard like tangled smoke, Malcolm carried an old, battered army rucksack slung over one shoulder. Olive-drab canvas, its military insignia long faded, and its straps gnawed by time. Locals recognized him, even if they never really saw him. Unlike other street dwellers who hollered for spare change or caused scenes outside bodegas, Malcolm moved like a whisper, quiet, worn, and largely invisible. He scavenged recyclables for change, nodded politely at restaurant staff who occasionally slid him scraps, and never lingered in one doorway too long. He didn't want to be a burden, just a shadow passing through. Almost no one knew that Malcolm had spent 22 years in the U.S. Army. He'd left service in 2005, quietly and without fanfare. When his wife Helen died of cancer in 2009, a diagnosis the VA hospital originally botched, Malcolm unraveled. Guilt sank its teeth in. He pushed away every hand that reached for him, sold their modest walk-up apartment, donated the proceeds to a little-known animal shelter his wife loved, and slipped into obscurity. It's easier being no one, he'd once told a soup kitchen volunteer, than being the someone who couldn't save her. On a viciously cold evening in early December, with the wind scraping skin and snow promising to fall like judgment, Malcolm stepped into DeLuca's corner grocer. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. His fingers trembled, not from fear but hunger, as he tucked a stale loaf of rye under his coat while Mr. DeLuca argued with a supplier near the register. But DeLuca had recently installed panoramic security mirrors. "Hey, hold it!" he barked, eyes narrowing, already dialing. "I'm calling the cops." Malcolm didn't bolt. He didn't even flinch. The bread sat half-eatable beneath his open zipper, like a half-confession. "I just needed enough to stay alive one more day," he said, barely audible. Minutes later, 2 patrol officers arrived. The younger one, Officer Malik Torres, fumbled slightly as he applied handcuffs to the frail man's wrists. His eyes caught the glint of a chain around Malcolm's neck, military dog tags, dulled by grime and time. "You really serve?" Torres asked, lifting the ID tag that looked nearly fossilized. Malcolm gave a solemn nod. "I used to matter. Not anymore." "Still gotta bring you in," Torres said, with more shame than anger. "Store owner's pressing charges. Says it's not the first time you've lifted from him." At the precinct, Malcolm was booked like any other petty offender. A public defender gave him 15 seconds and 0 eye contact. No questions, just a folded paper, and a muttered court date for the next morning. When dawn rolled around, Malcolm was led into Municipal Courtroom 2B, still in the same sagging clothes from the day before, now wrinkled from a night spent under buzzing fluorescent lights. No family showed up, no old friends, no one to whisper a word on his behalf. The room held only disinterested attorneys, reporters busy with better scandals, and court clerks drowning in routine. "Case 48-291, State of New York versus Malcolm Reeves," the court clerk called out, flatly. A young assistant DA shuffled forward, adjusting his over-starched collar. "Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended stealing bread from DeLuca's grocer. Due to a string of prior incidents and no permanent residence, we request continued detention pending trial." The judge, Honorable Terrence Langford, famous for his speed and saltiness, glanced at the case file without lifting his head. The courtroom had already checked out. Just another homeless vet, shuffling through the revolving door of the system. "Mr. Reeves, how do you plead?" Langford asked, barely glancing up. "Guilty, Your Honor," Malcolm said softly. "I was starving." A chuckle bubbled up from the back row. Langford's head snapped up, glare sharp enough to kill. Then, something changed. "Malcolm Alexander Reeves, former Master Sergeant, U.S. Army," Langford read aloud, squinting at the file. Silence descended like a curtain. The judge's fingers gripped the edge of the bench until his knuckles whitened. He looked at Malcolm, then the file, then back again. Something cracked in his eyes. Without a word, Judge Langford stood. Every jaw in the room dropped. Judges don't stand during routine hearings. It just doesn't happen. He said nothing, just stood there, breathing shallow, staring into some past only he could see. Your Honor, the prosecutor asked tentatively, unsure whether to continue or call an ambulance. Court will recess for 15 minutes, Langford rasped finally. The defendant will remain seated. And just like that, he disappeared into his chambers. Murmurs ignited. What just happened? Why would a tough, no-nonsense judge stop cold for a shoplifting charge? Malcolm sat like stone, his eyes locked on the linoleum, unfazed. Or perhaps he expected nothing, not even the extraordinary. Something about that name, Malcolm Reeves, had detonated a buried memory. What would make a hard-edged judge freeze mid-sentence? Why did the courtroom fall under a spell the second his name was read aloud? You'll want to hear this. In the privacy of his chambers, Judge Langford opened a hidden drawer and pulled out an old, creased photo. A group of soldiers in desert uniforms, squinting under the Iraqi sun, stood in front of a sand-blasted medical tent. His hand shook slightly as he traced the figures. There he was, 20 years younger, a combat medic, before law school, before the robe, and behind him, tall and steady, stood Malcolm Reeves. Langford turned to his computer, accessing a secured military database he still had clearance to. He typed in the name with surgical precision. Up came the record. Master Sergeant Malcolm A. Reeves. 3 deployments, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. Specialist in logistics, commendation, Bronze Star for Valor. The reason? In 2004, when their convoy was ambushed on a desolate road, Malcolm had commandeered a flaming truck to steer it away from wounded soldiers, absorbing shrapnel, third-degree burns, but saving 17 lives in the process. And now he was in court, over a loaf of stale rye bread. In the judge's chambers, a war came roaring back to life. The file in front of Judge Terrence Langford didn't just confirm what he feared, it revealed something far heavier. There it was, a photograph once plastered across the front page of the New York Times. Malcolm Reeves, younger and unbroken, sprinting through Afghan dust while cradling a wounded child in his arms. It was a photo America had forgotten, but Langford hadn't. That wasn't what stopped his breath. Buried deeper in the file, tagged declassified as of 2022, was a mission report from July 2004, Fallujah, Iraq. Amid a chaotic withdrawal under enemy fire, then Staff Sergeant Malcolm Reeves carried a critically injured field medic across 2 miles of open terrain, despite his own wounds. The name of that medic? Private First Class Michael Langford. The judge whispered it like a prayer. It's him. All these years, he'd searched for the man who dragged him through hellfire and refused to leave him behind. He never even knew the man's full name, just remembered Reeves, yelled through a maelstrom of bullets. That was it. Until now. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, Malcolm sat alone, forgotten again. The bailiff didn't look up from his phone. The prosecutor scrolled headlines. No one noticed the man who'd once saved 17 soldiers with a flaming supply truck, or the one man now wearing the robe because Malcolm had carried him out of a kill zone. For 15 years, Malcolm had lived in society's blind spot, a ghost in tattered layers, his past dismissed with the same ease as his presence. After losing Helen, the only person who tethered him to the world, he'd unraveled quietly. No pension, no paperwork, no appeals. He couldn't fight for benefits when the very system that failed her wore the same logos as his old uniform. So he vanished. Kids mocked him, shopkeepers sprayed him off sidewalks like trash, police moved him along like static, even fellow homeless gave him distance. Some nights his screams broke the silence. Other nights he barely breathed. When the cold dug into his ribs, He'd scrounge enough for cough syrup and huddle in his coat like it was armor. On the worst days, he'd take out Helen's photo, sealed in a plastic bag, never once folded. "Almost there, Maggie," he'd murmur. "Just need to hold on a little longer." Back in his chambers, Langford sprang into action. First a call to the VA, then to a name from the past. Colonel James Mason, now retired but still sharp. "Jim, it's Langford. I found him." A silence followed that felt like an aftershock. "The man who dragged me out of Fallujah, he's here, in my courtroom, charged with stealing a loaf of bread." Mason's voice cracked when he replied, "I'm 3 hours away. Don't let him leave." Langford didn't wait. He scribbled a personal note, unsigned but unmistakable. "Malcolm Reeves is not a petty criminal. He's a symbol of loyalty forgotten by the country he served." He couldn't dismiss the case himself. Judicial ethics bound him. But he could shift the course. As the recess drew to a close, the judge's clerk noticed something odd on her desk. A photo that hadn't been there earlier. It was that photo. Malcolm carrying the Afghan child. Beneath it, a note in firm script. "Some heroes never asked to be remembered." She recognized the handwriting. It was Colonel Mason's. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't about a vagrant with sticky fingers. It was about a man who had moved mountains quietly and whose story had touched lives that now shaped his fate. When court resumed, Malcolm felt it. The air had shifted. The judge's face no longer wore the hardened mask of bureaucracy. There was something behind his eyes now, something Malcolm hadn't seen in years. Recognition. Respect. Before Malcolm could process it, Judge Langford cleared his throat. "In light of new information regarding the defendant's background, this court will delay all proceedings pending full review," he announced, each word weighted. "The defendant will remain in custody until tomorrow's hearing," he added, "and ensure Mr. Reeves receives a proper meal and medical care." The prosecutor blinked, baffled. He didn't object. Malcolm nodded, used to decisions being made without his input. As he was led out, he barely caught the judge's final order. But it stuck. "Make sure he's treated like the soldier he is." That evening, the headlines began to drip out. "Reed thief or war hero. Judge delays sentencing in unusual case. Homeless man claims to be decorated vet. Internet remains skeptical." The comment section ignited. "Bet he bought that dog tag at a pawn shop." Judge Carmichael took his seat, but something had changed. His tone was different. Measured, yes, but now charged with something else. Something personal. "Before we address the charges against Mr. Grady," he began, "this court will first hear testimony that may bear significantly on the matter at hand." Walter blinked, still unsure what was happening, as Colonel James Mason took the stand. 20 years older, but the same steel in his spine. "I am Colonel James Mason," he said, after being sworn in. "Currently stationed at Fort Hamilton. I've known the defendant, Staff Sergeant Walter Grady, since Iraq, 2003. He turned to face Walter, eyes steady. "This man saved 17 American lives when our convoy was ambushed outside Fallujah. Under heavy enemy fire, he drove a fuel truck already on fire away from our position. Second-degree burns, shrapnel in his leg, and he did it to prevent a blast that would have killed us all." A ripple of stunned murmurs spread through the gallery. "Later that same day," Mason continued, "he carried a wounded medic, Private First Class Michael Carmichael, 2 miles to safety through hostile territory." The name hit the courtroom like a dropped stone in still water. All eyes turned to the bench. Judge Carmichael gave the smallest of nods, confirmation. The prosecutor stood, clearly rattled. "Your Honor, while this is commendable, it doesn't change the facts of the present." Colonel Mason cut him off. "There's more. An audit of VA records uncovered an error. Due to a system migration in 2008, Sergeant Grady's benefits were terminated. Paperwork was sent to an old address. He never received it. For the past 15 years, he has been owed over $246,000, 0 cents, in unpaid pension and medical coverage. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. Even Walter looked shaken, his hands gripping the defense table like he needed something to hold him down. Mason wasn't done. We have affidavits from 5 members of his unit all attesting to his character, including this letter from General Richards. His son was in that convoy. Walter saved him too. The judge removed his glasses and looked at Walter. "Mr. Grady," he said, voice steady, "please approach the bench." Walter rose slowly, every movement wary, like a man walking into another ambush. But the judge's tone softened. "Protocol prevents me from ruling on a case involving a personal connection. But yesterday, I didn't know who you were. I didn't recognize the man who saved my life in Fallujah." A quiet gasp moved through the gallery. "I never knew your full name," the judge continued, eyes misting. "Only Grady," shouted over gunfire. Walter's voice came rough, rusted from years of silence. "I was just doing my job, sir." "You did far more than that," the judge replied. "And this country has done far less than it should have for you." He turned to the prosecutor. "In light of these extraordinary circumstances, does the state wish to proceed?" The young prosecutor stood. His voice faltered slightly. "No, Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges, with prejudice." "So ordered," said the judge. "Mr. Grady, you are free to go, and this court extends its deepest apologies for the injustice you've suffered, not just here, but for the past 15 years. Walter didn't speak. He couldn't. The moment crashed over him, years of silence and shame breaking like a dam. And then the doors opened again. A woman in her 30s stepped in, her face streaked with tears. She scanned the room until her eyes found his. "Uncle Walter," she whispered, walking toward him. "I'm Rebecca, Margaret's niece. We've been looking for you for years." He tried to stand but couldn't. She crossed the floor and wrapped her arms around him. And for the first time in years, Walter felt something real. Human touch that wasn't a shove or a grip on a wrist or a pair of cold handcuffs. Outside, reporters surged forward. Colonel Mason addressed the cameras. "This isn't just about one veteran. It's about the thousands, like Walter Grady, forgotten by the system they fought for. Today, we begin to make that right." By afternoon, the story exploded online. News helicopters circled overhead as Walter emerged from the courthouse, clean-shaven, wearing donated clothes. On either side stood Judge Carmichael and Colonel Mason, not as officials, but as men. Even Mr. Morelli, the store owner, fought through the crowd to reach him. "I didn't know," he said, guilt thick in his voice. "I thought you were just another vagrant. I'm sorry." Walter nodded faintly. Words still wouldn't come. Within 2 days, a national veterans organization launched a support fund. It passed $200,000, 0 cents in under 48 hours. Social media ignited with similar stories. Veterans lost in paperwork, benefits cut by error. The VA announced an emergency review, and in a quiet room far from the flashbulbs, Judge Carmichael finally said what he'd carried for 2 decades. "You dragged me 2 miles with metal in your leg. The medic said you refused treatment until I was stabilized." Walter shrugged. "You were worse off than me. You said something to me when I was fading in and out." The judge's voice thickened. "You said, 'Just keep breathing, kid, your story's not over.' Those words kept me alive. I became a judge because I wanted to serve like you did." Walter looked at him now, not as a figure in robes, but as a boy he remembered bleeding on the ground. "I'm glad something good came from that day." "Not just something good," Carmichael said softly, "everything good. My chance to make a difference. It all exists because you didn't leave me behind." For the first time in years, Walter smiled. Not the tight, reflexive grimace he'd worn to shield himself, but something real. Something that reached his eyes and softened the lines around them. "No man left behind," he said. "That was just a saying for me." 3 days later, Walter stood in the judge's private chambers, not as a defendant, but as a decorated veteran. He wore a dark blue suit tailored just for him, the medals pinned to his chest finally telling the story he had carried alone for decades. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, campaign ribbons faded but gleaming in the light. A representative from Veterans Affairs stepped forward, formally acknowledging the $246,000 in back benefits, plus an additional settlement for the bureaucratic error that had derailed his life. Flashbulbs captured the moment, but Walter didn't flinch. "I don't want anyone's pity," he said into the microphones. "I just want to make sure the next ones don't get forgotten like I was." The story spread like a spark in dry grass. A viral moment turned movement. Legislators quoted his case in floor debates. Veterans organizations demanded reviews. Commentators, once dismissive, now used Walter's name like a banner. The photo of Walter in Iraq, cradling the injured Afghan child, resurfaced, this time placed side by side with a shot of him ragged and hollow-eyed on a Brooklyn curb. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One man, two Americas. For 15 years, Walter Grady had been invisible. Now he had become unforgettable. 6 months later, Walter moved into Veterans Village, a new supportive housing community in Brooklyn. His unit was modest, but warm, quiet, and his. A bookshelf held worn paperbacks and Margaret's old photo albums. A single wall bore a silent gallery, Margaret on their wedding day, his unit in Iraq. A recent picture, him shaking hands with Judge Carmichael at a veterans recognition event. He declined most media requests, but when a local school invited him to speak to teenagers, he accepted. He told the truth, unembellished. What it meant to serve, what it felt like to be forgotten, and how dignity doesn't disappear, it just sometimes goes unseen. The kids listened, really listened. In Walter, they saw not a lecture, but a story still unfolding. Each afternoon, he visited Prospect Park. He'd sit on a bench, the same bench where he used to sleep when the shelter line was full, the cold too cruel for concrete. Now, he sat upright, hat tipped back, watching the playground chaos of laughter and scraped knees. Sometimes, he smiled. Outside the courthouse, where it all began, workers installed a new bronze plaque. Justice is remembering those who were once forgotten. Beside it, a relief sculpture captured a moment frozen in time, Walter carrying a wounded young medic through sand and smoke, the American flag rippling behind them. At the dedication, the mayor announced the creation of an annual legal fund for homeless veterans, the Grady Initiative. Walter didn't speak. He simply placed his hand on the cold bronze, nodded once, and stepped back. Elsewhere in the city, a 10-year-old boy who had once seen Walter collecting cans wrote a school essay. Not everyone in torn clothes is bad. Some people wear memories instead. The essay won a citywide prize. It was read aloud during a city council meeting on homelessness. Walter stayed close with Judge Carmichael, now just Michael to him. Sometimes he joined the family for dinner, quiet but present. On one such evening, the judge's son asked, "Were you angry about being homeless for so long?" Walter thought for a long time. "No," he said finally. "I don't need pity. I just hope the ones who come next remember the ones who came before." On Veterans Day, Walter stood before a crowd at Fort Hamilton, back in dress uniform for the first time in decades. The medals were the same, but the man was different. He stepped to the podium, cleared his throat, and spoke. "I once protected this country," he said, voice steady. "Now the country has protected me back." A pause, then, "Kindness is never too late. It just needs someone patient enough to wait for it." He stepped down as the crowd of military brass, new recruits, and aging vets rose in silent salute. Walter straightened, returned the gesture, eyes fixed forward. No longer burdened by shame, no longer looking down. For the first time in years, he could see the road ahead. A bronze glint outside the Brooklyn courthouse caught the morning sun. Justice may be delayed, but it is never absent. Don't give up, especially when you're doing what's right.